August 1945, Istanbul. Konstantin Volkov, a Soviet NKVD intelligence officer working in Turkey under diplomatic cover, called the British embassy on edge. He had made an irreversible decision to defect to the British side and reveal everything he knew. And he knew enough for British intelligence to pay any price for his head, and for the Soviet side to bury it. At a meeting with a British officer, he placed a handwritten, not typed, sheet of paper on the table. He explained why. Soviet intelligence had access to British encryption channels. Only paper. Only in person. No telegrams. The paper contained everything. The structure of the Soviet agent network in Britain, names, and, most importantly, Volkov wrote that he could identify a Soviet agent currently holding one of the highest positions in British counterintelligence. In return, he asked for one thing: asylum and his life. The British officer read it, reread it, and sent a dispatch to London through a regular encrypted channel. In London, the dispatch landed on the desk of the very person Volkov had just described, Kim Philby, a high-ranking MI6 officer and a Soviet agent since 1934. Philby read the dispatch and immediately understood everything. If Volkov spoke, he was dead. Not metaphorically, but literally. British justice for a traitor of such magnitude meant the gallows. There was no time to deliberate. He acted coldly and swiftly. He delayed the bureaucratic processing of the case for several weeks, insisting that he would fly to Istanbul personally, deeming the matter too delicate to entrust to anyone else. While the approvals went through various channels, he contacted his Soviet handler and informed them of everything about Volkov. Philby arrived in Istanbul 3 weeks after Volkov's initial contact with the British. Volkov was already gone. British officers observed stretchers being loaded onto a Soviet plane at the airport. The person on the stretcher was bandaged from head to toe, unconscious or unable to move. Several large men in civilian clothes stood nearby. The plane departed eastward. What happened to Volkov in Moscow is unknown, though he was presumably executed. His name never surfaced in Soviet archives. Philby returned to London with a clean report. The operation had failed, the source was unavailable, and circumstances were unfavorable. But for the first time in 11 years of working on two fronts, suspicion fell upon him. Not proof, not evidence, just a subtly changed look from his colleagues. A file someone had placed not in the archive, but on a closer shelf. This marked the beginning of his end. But to understand the full extent of the damage Philby inflicted on British intelligence, how much he shifted the course of the Cold War in favor of the USSR, and how he ultimately failed, we need to rewind 15 years. Back to Cambridge in 1934, to a modest Austrian researcher named Arnold Deutsch, and to a conversation after which Kim Philby became a different man, while outwardly remaining the same. Deutsch was a Soviet intelligence officer working in London under the guise of an academic researcher. Small, inconspicuous, with the gentle manners of a Viennese intellectual and an absolute understanding of human psychology, Moscow had given him a specific task: to find young men in elite British universities who could be persuaded, not bought. The difference was fundamental. A bought agent works as long as they are paid. A convinced agent works because they believe. Cambridge in '34 was an ideal hunting ground for such a mission. The Great Depression had eroded liberal illusions. Hitler had risen to power in Germany, and no one in Europe understood how to stop him. Young men from privileged families sat in beautiful colleges, looking at a world that was crumbling, and searching for a system of coordinates that would make sense of it. The Soviet Union seemed to be the answer, not because they knew the truth about Soviet reality, but because they didn't, and because Deutsch knew how to tell precisely the version they wanted to hear. Kim Philby was introduced to Deutsch by a mutual acquaintance from Cambridge's left-wing circles. The meeting took place in London. Deutsch simply talked for several hours, listening more than speaking, asking questions, allowing Philby to articulate what he had already come to internally. It was not a recruitment conversation in the usual sense. It was a discussion between two people, one of whom had a compass, and the other, a desire to find it. Philby agreed at the end of that first meeting. Deutsch's first instruction was unexpected and demanded extraordinary self-control from the 22-year-old student. No communism. Publicly. Not a word, Not a gesture, not a hint. Break all visible ties with the left. Join a pro-Nazi organization if necessary for cover. Become a person of impeccably right-wing views. A journalist, then a civil servant, then an intelligence officer. Build a career that would eventually grant access to the information Moscow needed. Deutsch invested in a man who, in 10 years, would be invisible from the surface. Only depth. Philby began immediately. In 1937, he traveled to Spain to cover the Civil War for the Times, a London newspaper. But he went not to the Republican side, where his secret sympathizers fought, but to Franco's side. He built a reputation as a conservative journalist trusted by the right, making connections. In February 1938, a shell exploded a few meters from Philby's car. 2 colleagues died. He escaped with scratches. Franco personally awarded him the Order of the Red Arrow. British newspapers lauded the brave correspondent. Moscow watched. Moscow was pleased. In 1940, Philby joined MI6 through the front door, with brilliant recommendations, a reputation as a man of right-wing views, and combat experience from the Spanish War. His dossier looked impeccable, and it should have. He had been building it for 6 years. This was the beginning. And here, the story becomes truly incredible. Because what Philby did in MI6 was not just espionage, it was the systematic destruction of Western intelligence from within. Operation after operation. Agent after agent. Year after year. With the methodical precision that distinguishes an engineer, not an adventurer. The first thing to understand is that Philby didn't just pass on documents. He conveyed context. He explained to his Soviet handlers not only what was written in the papers, but what it meant, how it related to other operations, where the weak points were, and how to use the information to maximum detriment to the enemy. This made his value incomparable to that of an ordinary agent who merely photographed files. In 1941, the Germans attacked the USSR. By this point, British intelligence was already working on decrypting German codes, the Ultra program, the breaking of the Enigma machine. Churchill received German operational plans almost in real time. This was one of the main Allied secrets of the war, so carefully guarded that the British sometimes deliberately did not react to German attacks to avoid revealing the source. The Soviet Union was an ally, but the British were hesitant to share ultra information with Moscow. The risk of leaks was too great. Stalin received decrypts in a measured way, without indicating the source, presented as intelligence data. Philby knew about ultra. He knew its scope. He knew exactly what the British were hiding from the Soviet side. And he relayed everything London wanted to keep from the USSR spring 1943. The German command was preparing Operation Citadel, the largest tank offensive on the Kursk Bulge. Hitler intended to cut off the Soviet salient and turn the tide of the war on the Eastern Front. The operation plans, detailed with dates and dispositions, fell into the hands of British intelligence through Enigma decrypts. The Soviet side was given some information, but not all, and not immediately. Philby ensured that Moscow received the full content of the British decrypts, including what the British were withholding. The Soviet command received an exhaustive picture of the German plan well in advance. Marshal Zhukov, the chief Soviet general, had time to prepare a deep defense when German tanks advanced in. July 43, they were expected. The Battle of Kursk became the Wehrmacht's largest defeat and definitively turned the tide of the war. The exact role Philby's information played in this is debated by historians. Soviet intelligence had several sources on Operation Citadel, but the fact that Philby gave Moscow the complete British intelligence product on the German plan is documented in Soviet archives that partially opened in the 1990s. This was, perhaps, the most important information he ever transmitted. The price, hundreds of thousands of lives, on both sides, depending on which side you look from. But the war ended, and a new phase began, one that ultimately defined the scale of Philby's damage to the West. In 1944, he took charge of a new MI6 department, the Counter-Soviet Intelligence Department. Think about that detail for a second. A man recruited by Soviet intelligence in 1934 was appointed in 1944 to lead the fight against Soviet intelligence. This is not irony. This is the result of 10 years of patiently building a cover. Deutsch instilled this idea in Philby from the very beginning, and it worked with a precision that surpassed any plan. In this position, Philby saw everything. Every agent MI6 tried to infiltrate into the USSR. Every operation against Soviet special services, every communication channel, every source's name. Every name went to Moscow. Autumn 1945. The American Manhattan Project concluded. Bombs dropped on Japan. The Soviet Union was working on its own atomic program, but was lagging, by Western experts' estimates, by at least 5 to 7 years. The CIA and MI6 knew about the Soviet program and tracked channels through which technical secrets might leak. In November 1945, Elizabeth Bentley, a Soviet intelligence courier who had worked with a network of American agents since the early 1940s, surfaced in Washington. She defected to the FBI and brought with her something priceless: a list. Names of about 100 Soviet agents and sources operating in the U.S. Scientists, officials, government employees, people with access to atomic secrets. The FBI began developing each name on the list. Arrests, interrogations, trials, all were ahead. The Soviet intelligence network in America was supposed to be destroyed. Bentley reported her defection not only to the FBI, the information was passed to the Allies, to MI6, and landed on Kim Philby's desk. He read the list. He assessed the scale of the threat to Soviet networks in America, and he immediately contacted his handler. Everyone Bentley named received a warning. Some managed to go underground before the FBI reached them with concrete evidence. Some destroyed incriminating materials. Some simply stopped communicating with the Soviet side, not because they were arrested, but because they knew they were under surveillance. The FBI conducted a large-scale operation and achieved significantly less than it expected. A few arrests, a few trials, but not the destruction of the network, only its partial damage. For years, American investigators did not understand why. In parallel, the atomic program. Klaus Fuchs, a German émigré physicist who worked on the British atomic project and then on the American Manhattan Project, was a Soviet agent who had been transmitting technical data on atomic weapons since 1941. He would only be arrested in 1950 when the Americans deciphered Soviet intelligence telegrams from the Venona program. Philby was not involved in Fuchs's recruitment. He had been recruited before the war through an independent channel. But Philby knew about his work. He knew the volume of information being transmitted. And when, in the late 1940s, Western counterintelligence began to unravel the threads leading to Fuchs, Philby saw this from inside the investigation and could regulate the speed at which the threads unwound. The Soviet atomic project received British and American technical solutions that shortened the path to the bomb by several years. In August 1949, the USSR tested its first atomic device. Western experts were stunned. They had not expected this until the mid-1950s at the earliest. America's atomic monopoly collapsed sooner than anyone predicted. How much of this was due to Fuchs? How much to other agents? How much to Philby, who provided them cover? No one can say for sure. But the fact that Philby knew about the atomic secret leaks and prevented none of them is a fact. 1949. Now let's discuss the operations he destroyed as a direct supervisor. A joint British-American operation in Albania. Enver Hoxha's communist regime was sustained by Soviet support. MI6 and the CIA developed a plan to infiltrate groups of armed émigrés into the country who were supposed to ignite armed resistance, establish contact with the anti-communist underground, and destabilize the regime from within. Philby supervised the operation. He knew the infiltration routes. He knew the dates. He knew the names of the people being sent across the border. The first group entered Albania in October 1949. They were awaited at the border. Some were immediately arrested. Some were shot trying to escape back. Several people went missing. It was decided that the failure was accidental. Security measures were tightened. Routes were changed. A second group. Again, an ambush at the border. Again, arrests and executions. A third, a fourth. Again and again, people entered the country and disappeared. The Albanian Ministry of Internal Affairs met each group as if it knew the exact time and place of crossing. Because it did. The operation was shut down in 1952, after several dozen people were killed or ended up in the dungeons of Albania's secret police, Sigurimi. The official version of the failure: poor operational security, leaks through Greek intermediaries, and low quality of preparation of the émigrés themselves. No one suspected Philby. He participated in the post-mortems of the failures himself. He offered theories as to why things went wrong. He recommended measures that were supposed to prevent recurrence. In parallel, the same story in Ukraine and the Baltics. Infiltration of agents to connect with the anti-Soviet underground. Again, precise ambushes. Again, immediate arrests. Again, the complete destruction of agent networks that had been built for years. The death toll from these operations is several dozen confirmed, possibly over 100 if you count everyone whose exposure was triggered down the chain. And now, 1949 again. But this time, Washington. MI6 sent Philby to the American capital as its official representative to the CIA. There was no higher post for a British intelligence officer in relations with the Americans. He became the liaison between the two main Western intelligence services. His American counterpart and closest friend was James Angleton, a brilliant young CIA officer predicted for a great future. They dined together several times a week. Angleton admired Philby, his professionalism, his understanding of Soviet intelligence, his analytical mind. He shared assessments and plans with him with the candor one reserves only for someone completely trusted. Each of those dinners cost the West a loss in the radio games with Soviet intelligence. It is here, in Washington, in 1950 to 51, that the story of Volkov unfolds in its full context. By then, the American Venona program had begun to yield results. Decryptions of Soviet military telegrams pointed to an agent in the British Embassy in Washington, a person who had worked there in 1944 to 45. The circle of suspects narrowed. The name of Donald McLean, a member of the same Cambridge Five, surfaced more and more clearly. McLean did not know he was under investigation, but Philby knew. He saw the investigation from the inside. Guy Burgess, another member of the Five, a longtime friend of Philby, was living with him in Washington at the time and working at the British Embassy. It was through Burgess that Philby delivered the warning to McLean. Leave immediately. Documents point to you. There is no time. In May 1951, McLean and Burgess disappeared. A ferry from Southampton to France. Then, to the USSR. Just days before McLean's scheduled interrogation. This was the moment when the shadow first fell on Philby. Burgess lived with him. Their friendship was publicly known. The escape of two Soviet agents seemed to coincide too perfectly with the threat to McLean. The CIA pressured MI6. Angleton, the man who trusted Philby as a friend, sensed something was wrong. MI6 recalled Philby from Washington. Interrogations began. Investigator Mills worked methodically. He presented circumstantial evidence. He pointed to too many coincidences. He directly stated that he believed Philby was the third man, the one who warned McLean. The interrogations lasted several months. Philby held firm. This is a separate chapter that is difficult to explain rationally. The man knew that he was responsible for the blood of dozens of agents, destroyed operations, transmitted atomic secrets, and saved Soviet networks. Under pressure from professional investigators who directly accused him of treason, he did not utter a word. He did not get tangled in his testimony. He did not give a single contradiction that could be recorded and presented. The explanation is one: 20 years of training. 20 years of a life in which every word was controlled, every reaction was measured, every conversation was a potential test. By 51, Philby could hold up under pressure as naturally as an ordinary person breathes. No evidence was found. The case was closed. Insufficient grounds. Philby left MI6, officially by his own volition. Several years of journalism. In 1955, Foreign Secretary Macmillan stated in Parliament that there was no reason to believe Philby was a Soviet agent. Public rehabilitation. In 1956, Philby was back at work. Beirut. Correspondent. Officially. MI6 agent. Semi-officially. KGB agent. Still. Meetings with Soviet handlers in Beirut were regular. Documents from Soviet archives that became available after 1991 show that during his Beirut period, Philby transmitted comprehensive information about British agent networks in the Middle East, MI6's methods in the region, and operations the British conducted jointly with the Americans against Soviet influence in Arab countries. By the early 1960s, his time was running out. Anatoly Golitsyn, a KGB officer who defected to the West in December 1961, brought information about Soviet agents in British special services. He didn't name specific individuals, but the descriptions were accurate enough. MI6 grew nervous. Nicholas Elliott, one of the few people who were truly friends with Philby, flew to Beirut in January 1963. Two old friends. A closed-door conversation. Elliott presented new evidence and offered a deal, a full confession in exchange for immunity. According to available information, Philby began to speak. Partially. He admitted some early connections with Soviet intelligence. He promised to continue. Elliott flew back to London. A few days later, January 23, 1963, Kim Philby disappeared from Beirut. A Soviet cargo ship, the Dolmatovo, Odessa, Moscow. In Moscow, he was greeted as a victor, the rank of KGB colonel, Soviet citizenship, an apartment, orders, everything the state gives to those it considers its own. James Angleton, the man who had dined with him several times a week in Washington, became a different person after Philby's defection. Literally. He spent the rest of his career convinced that Soviet agents had thoroughly infiltrated the entire CIA. He orchestrated a witch hunt that paralyzed American intelligence for years. He was fired in 1974. He died in 1987 with the same paranoia. This, too, is part of Philby's legacy. The paranoia he sowed simply by his existence. In Britain, closed investigations continued for several years. A full report on the damage inflicted has never been published. Parts remain classified to this day. MI6 does not like to publicly tally how many people died and how many operations were destroyed thanks to a man they themselves cultivated and promoted. Kim Philby lived in Moscow for 25 years. He consulted for the KGB. He lectured cadets. He wrote memoirs. He drank heavily, according to those who knew him during his Moscow period. His lost wife, Rufina Bukova, was more than 20 years his junior, and by her own account, saved him from ultimate self-destruction. He died on May 11th, 1988. He was buried with military honors. His gravestone was modest, Soviet style. In 2012, Russia issued a postage stamp with his portrait in the Russian Intelligence Officers series. London expressed regret. Moscow shrugged. Each side in this story has its own word for the same man. Hero, traitor, professional, killer, idealist, mole. All words are correct, all at once. He sat in that office, listened to the best people in Britain, remembered, left, transmitted. 29 years. Until one defector from Istanbul called the British consulate and wrote by hand on a sheet of paper that he knew the name of a Soviet agent holding a senior position in British counterintelligence. Volkov named him almost exactly. He just didn't get to say the name.